Chapter 6 Synod in the Waldensian Valleys. The Duke of Savoy was sincere in the promise that the Vaudois should not be disturbed, but fully to make it good was not altogether in his power. He could take care that such armies of crusaders as that which mustered under the standard of Cataneo should not invade their valleys, but he could not guard them from the secret machinations of the priesthood. In the absence of the armed crusader, the missionary and the inquisitor assailed them. Some were seduced, others were kidnapped and carried off to the Holy Office. To these annoyances was added the yet greater evil of a decaying piety. A desire for repose made many conform outwardly to the Romish Church. Quote, "In order to be shielded from all interruption in their journeys on business, they obtained from the priests, who were settled in the valleys, certificates or testimonials of their being papists. To obtain this credential it was necessary to attend the Romish chapel, to confess, to go to Mass, and to have their children baptized by the priests. For this shameful and criminal dissimulation they fancied they made amends by muttering to themselves when they entered the Romish temples, quote, 'Cave of robbers, may God confound thee.' At the same time they continued to attend the preaching of the Vaudois pastors, and to submit themselves to their censures. But beyond all question, the men who practiced these deceits, and the church that tolerated them, had greatly declined. That old vine seemed to be dying. A little while, and it would disappear from off those mountains which it had so long covered with the shadow of its boughs. But he who had planted it looked down from heaven and visited it. It was now that the Reformation broke out. The river of the water of life was opened a second time and began to flow through Christendom. The old and dying stock in the Alps, drinking of the celestial stream, lived anew. Its boughs began to be covered with blossoms and fruit as of old. The Reformation had begun its career, and had already stirred most of the countries of Europe to their depths before tidings of the mighty change reached these secluded mountains. When at last the great news was announced, the Vaudois, quote, were as men who dreamed. Eager to have them confirmed, and to know to what extent the yoke of Rome had been cast off by the nations of Europe, they sent forth Pastor Martin, of the valley of Lucerna, on a mission of inquiry. In 1526 he returned with the amazing intelligence that the light of the old evangel had broken on Germany, on Switzerland, on France, and that every day was adding to the number of those who openly professed the same doctrines to which the Vaudois had borne witness from ancient times. To attest what he said, he produced the books he had received in Germany containing the views of the Reformers. The remnant of the Vaudois were on the north of the Alps also sent out men to collect information respecting the great spiritual revolution which had so surprised and gladdened them. In 1530 the churches of Provence and Dauphine commissioned George Morel of Merindol and Pierre Masson of Burgundy to visit the reformers of Switzerland and Germany, and bring them word touching their doctrine and manner of life. The deputies met in conference with the members of the Protestant churches of Neuchâtel, Marat, and Bern. They had also interviews with Berthold Haller and William Farel. Going on to Basel, they presented to Ecolampadius in October 1530 a document in Latin containing a complete account of their ecclesiastical discipline, worship, doctrine, and manners. They begged in return that Ecolampadius would say whether he approved of the order and doctrine of their church, and if he held it to be defective, to specify in what points, and to what extent. The elder church submitted itself to the younger. The visit of these two pastors of this ancient church gave unspeakable joy to the reformer of Basel. He heard in them the voice of the primitive and apostolic church speaking to the Christians of the 16th century, and bidding them welcome within the gates of the city of God. What a miracle was before him! For ages had this church been in the fires, yet she had not been consumed. Was not this encouragement to those who were just entering into persecutions not less terrific? Quote, "We render thanks," said Ecolampadius in his letter, October 13th, 1530, to the churches of Provence, "to our most gracious Father that he has called you into such marvelous light. during ages in which thick darkness had covered almost the whole world under the empire of Antichrist. We love you as brethren." But his affection for them did not blind him to their declensions, nor make him withhold those admonitions which he saw to be needed. Quote, "As we approve of many things among you," he wrote, "so there are several things which we wish to see amended. We are informed that the fear of persecution has caused you to dissemble and to conceal your faith. There is no concord between Christ and Belial. You commune with unbelievers, you take part in their abominable masses, in which the death and passion of Christ are blasphemed. I know your weakness, but it becomes those who have been redeemed by the blood of Christ to be more courageous. It is better for us to die than to be overcome by temptation." It was thus that Ecolampadius, speaking in the name of the Church of the Reformation, repaid the Church of the Alps for the services she had rendered to the world in former ages. By sharp, faithful, brotherly rebuke, he sought to restore to her the purity and glory which she had lost. Having finished with Ecolampadius, the deputies went on to Strasbourg. There they had interviews with Bucer and Capito. A similar statement of their faith to the reformers of that city drew forth similar congratulations and counsels. In the clear light of her mourning, the Reformation Church saw many things which had grown dim in the evening of the Vaudois Church, and the reformers willingly permitted their elder sister the benefit of their own wider views. If the men of the 16th century recognized the voice of primitive Christianity speaking in the Vaudois, the latter heard the voice of the Bible, or rather of God himself, speaking in the reformers, and submitted themselves with modesty and docility to their reproofs. The last had become first. A manifold interest belongs to the meeting of these two churches. Each is a miracle to the other. The preservation of the Vaudois Church for so many ages amid the fires of persecution made her a wonder to the Church of the 16th century. The bringing up of the latter from the dead made her a yet greater wonder to the Church of the 1st century. These two churches compare their respective beliefs. They find that their creeds are not twain, but one. They compare the sources of their knowledge. They find that they have both of them drawn their doctrine from the Word of God. They are not two churches, they are one. They are the elder and the younger members of the same glorious family, the children of the same Father. What a magnificent monument of the true antiquity and genuine Catholicity of Protestantism! Only one of the two Provence deputies returned from their visit to the reformers of Switzerland. On their way back, at Dijon, suspicion, from some cause or other, fell on Pierre Masson. He was thrown into prison and ultimately condemned and burned. His fellow deputy was allowed to go on his way, George Morel, bearing the answers of the reformers, and especially the letters of Ecolampadius, happily arrived in safety in Provence. The documents he brought with him were much canvassed. Their contents caused these two ancient churches mingled joy and sorrow, the former, however, greatly predominating. The news touching the numerous body of Christians, now appearing in many lands, so full of knowledge and faith and courage, was literally astounding. The confessors of the Alps thought that they were alone in the world. Every successive century saw their numbers thinning, and their spirit growing less resolute. Their ancient enemy, on the other hand, was steadfastly widening her dominion and strengthening her sway. A little longer, they imagined, and all public faithful profession of the gospel would cease. It was at that moment they were told that a new army of champions had arisen to maintain the old battle. This announcement explained and justified the past to them, for now they beheld the fruits of their fathers' blood. They who had fought the battle were not to have the honor of the victory. That was reserved for combatants who had newly come to the field. They had forfeited this reward, they painfully felt, by their defections. Hence the regret that mingled with their joy. They proceeded to discuss the answers that should be made to the churches of the Protestant faith, considering especially whether they should adopt the reforms urged upon them in the communications which their deputies had brought back from the Swiss and German reformers. The great majority of the Vaudois Barbes were of opinion that they ought. A small minority, however, were opposed to this, because they thought that it did not become the new disciples to dictate to the old, or because they themselves were secretly inclined to the Romish superstitions. They went back again to the reformers for advice, and after repeated interchange of views, it was finally resolved to convene a synod in the valleys, at which all the questions between the two churches might be debated, and the relations which they were to sustain toward each other in time to come determined. If the Church of the Alps was to continue apart, as before the Reformation, she felt that she must justify her position by proving the existence of great and substantial differences in doctrine between herself and the newly arisen Church. But if no such differences existed, she would not, and dared not, remain separate and alone. She must unite with the Church of the Reformation. It was resolved that the coming synod should be a truly ecumenical one, a general assembly of all the children of the Protestant faith. A hearty invitation was sent forth, and it was cordially and generally responded to. All the Waldensian churches in the bosom of the Alps were represented in this synod. The Albigensian communities on the north of the chain and the Vaudois churches in Calabria sent deputies to it. The churches of French Switzerland chose William Farel and Anthony Saunier to attend it. From even more distant lands, as Bohemia, came men to deliberate and vote in this famous convention. The representatives assembled on the 12th of October, 1532. 2 years earlier, the Augsburg Confession had been given to the world, marking the culmination of the German Reformation. A year before, it says Zwingli, but I'm pretty sure it probably means Zwingli. Zwingli had died on the field of Cappel. In France, the Reformation was beginning to be illustrated by the heroic deaths of its children. Calvin had not taken his prominent place at Geneva, but he was already enrolled under the Protestant banner. The princes of the Schmalkald League were standing at bay in the presence of Charles V. It was a critical yet glorious era in the annals of Protestantism which saw this assembly convened. It met at the town of Chamfrens, in the heart of the valley of Angrogna. There are few grander or stronger positions in all that valley than the site occupied by this little town. The approach to it was defended by the heights of Rocomonier, and La Serre, and by defiles which now contract, now widen, but are everywhere overhung by great rocks and mighty chestnut trees, behind and above which rise the taller peaks, some of them snow-clad. More geography I'm skipping. The synod sat for 6 consecutive days. All the points raised in the communications received from the Protestant churches were freely discussed by the assembled barbes and elders. Their findings were embodied in a, quote, short confession of faith, which Monastier says, quote, may be considered as a supplement to the ancient confession of faith of the year 1120, which it does not contradict in any point. It consists of 17 articles, the chief of which are the moral inability of man, election to eternal life, the will of God as made known in the Bible, the only rule of duty, and the doctrine of 2 sacraments only, baptism and the Lord's Supper. The lamp which had been on the point of expiring began after this synod to burn with its former brightness. The ancient spirit of the Waldenses revived. They no longer practiced those dissimulations and cowardly concealments to which they had had recourse to avoid persecution. They no longer feared to confess their faith. Henceforward they were never seen at Mass or in the popish churches. They refused to recognize the priests of Rome as ministers of Christ, and under no circumstances would they receive any spiritual benefit or service at their hands. Another sign of new life that now animated the Vaudois was their setting about the work of rebuilding their churches. For 50 years before, public worship had been said to have ceased in their valleys. Their churches had been razed by the persecutor, and the Vaudois feared to rebuild them, lest they should draw down upon themselves a new storm of violence and blood. A cave would serve at times as a place of meeting. In more peaceful years, the house of their barb, or some of their chief men, would be converted into a church, and when the weather was fine, they would assemble on the mountainside, under the great boughs of their ancestral trees. But their old sanctuaries they dared not raise from the ruins into which the persecutor had cast them. They might say with their ancient Jews, "The holy and beautiful house in which our fathers praised thee is burned with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste." But now, strengthened by the fellowship and counsels of their Protestant brethren, churches arose, and the worship of God was reinstituted. Hard by the place where the synod met, at Lorenzo, namely, was the first of these post-Reformation churches set up. Others speedily followed in the other valleys. Pastors were multiplied, crowds flocked to their preaching, and not a few came from the plains of Piedmont, and from remote parts of their other valleys, to drink of these living waters again flowing in their land. Yet another token did this old church give of the vigorous life that was now flowing in her veins. This was a translation of the Scriptures into the French tongue. At the synod, the resolution was taken to translate and print both the Old and New Testaments, and as this was to be done at the sole charge of the Vaudois, it was considered as their gift to the churches of the Reformation, a most appropriate and noble gift. That book which the Waldenses had received from the primitive church, which their fathers had preserved with their blood, which their barbs had laboriously transcribed and circulated, they now put into the hands of the reformers, constituting them, along with themselves, the custodians of this, the ark of the world's hopes. Robert Levitan, a near relative of Calvin, was asked to undertake the translation, and he executed it with the help of his great kinsman, it is believed. It was printed in folio in black letter at Neuchâtel, in the year 1535, by Pierre de Wingle, commonly called Picard. The entire expense was defrayed by the Waldenses, who collected for this object 1,500 crowns of gold, a large sum for so poor a people. Thus did the Waldensian Church emphatically proclaim at the commencement of this new era in her existence, that the Word of God was her one sole foundation. As has been already mentioned, a commission to attend the synod had been given by the churches of French Switzerland to Farel and Saunier. Its fulfillment necessarily involved a great toil and peril. One crosses the Alps at this day so easily that it is difficult to conceive the toil and danger that attended the journey then. The deputies could not take the ordinary tracks across the mountains for fear of pursuit. They were compelled to travel by unfrequented paths. The way often led by the edge of precipices and abysses, up steep and dangerous ascents, and across fields of frozen snow. Nor were their pursuers the only dangers they had to fear. They were exposed to death from the blinding drifts and tempests of the hills. Nevertheless, they arrived in safety in the valleys, and added by their presence and their counsels to the dignity of this the first great ecclesiastical assembly of modern times. Of this we have a somewhat remarkable proof. 3 years thereafter, a Vaudois, Jean Perel of Angrogna, being cast into prison, deposed on his trial that, quote, he had kept guard for the ministers who taught the good law, who were assembled in the towns of Chamferans, in the center of Angrogna, and that among others present there was one called Farel, who had a red beard and a beautiful white horse, and 2 others accompanied him, one of whom had a horse, almost black, and the other was very tall and rather lame. That was the end of chapter 6. Now we're starting chapter 7. Persecutions and martyrdoms. The Church of the Alps had peace for 28 years. This was a time of great spiritual prosperity. Sanctuaries arose in all her valleys. Her pastors and teachers were found too few, and men of learning and zeal, some of them from foreign lands, pressed into her service. Individuals and families in the cities on the plain of Piedmont embraced her faith, and the crowds that attended her worship were continually growing. In short, this venerable church had a second youth. Her lamp, retrimmed, burned with a brightness that justified her time-honored motto, "A light shining in darkness." The darkness was not now so deep as it had been. The hours of night were drawing to a close. Nor was the Vaudois community the only light that now shone in Christendom. It was one of a constellation of lights, whose brilliance was beginning to irradiate the skies of the church with an effulgence which no former age had known. The exemption from persecution which the Waldenses enjoyed during this period was not absolute, but comparative. The lukewarm are seldom molested, and the quickened zeal of the Vaudois brought with it a revival of the persecutors' malignity, though it did not find vent in violences so dreadful as the tempest that had lately smitten them. Only 2 years after the synod, that is, in 1534, wholesale destruction fell upon the Vaudois churches in Provence, but the sad story of their extinction will more appropriately be told elsewhere. In the valleys of Piedmont, events were from time to time occurring that showed that the inquisitors' vengeance had been scotched, not killed. While the Vaudois as a race were prosperous, their churches multiplying and their faith extending its geographical area from one year to another, individual Vaudois were being at times seized and put to death at the stake, on the rack, or by the cord. 3 years after, the persecution broke out anew, and raged for a short time. Charles III of Savoy, a prince of mild manners, but under the rule of the priests, being solicited by the Archbishop of Turin and the Inquisitor of the same city, gave his consent to hunting down the heretics of the valleys. The commission was given to a nobleman of the name of Bersour, Bersour, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, whose residence was at Pinerolo, near the entrance of the valley of Perosa. Bersour, a man of savage disposition, collected a troop of 500 horse and foot, and attacked the valley of Angrogna. He was repulsed, but the storm which had rolled away from the mountains fell upon the plains. Turning to the Vaudois who resided around his own residence, he seized a great number of persons, whom he threw into the prisons and convents of Pinerolo and the Inquisition of Turin. Many of them suffered in the flames. One of these martyrs, Catalin Gerard, quaintly taught the spectators a parabolic lesson, standing at the pile. From amid the flames he asked for 2 stones, which were instantly brought him. The crowd looked on in silence, curious to know what he meant to do with them. Rubbing them against each other, he said, "You think to extinguish our poor churches by your persecutions. You can no more do so than I with my feeble hands can crush these stones." Heavier tempests seemed about to descend, when suddenly the sky cleared above the confessors of the Alps. It was a change in the politics of Europe in this instance, as in many others, that stayed the arm of persecution. Francis I of France demanded of Charles, Duke of Savoy, permission to march an army through his dominions. The object of the French king was the recovery of the Duchy of Milan, a long-contested prize between himself and Charles V. The Duke of Savoy refused the request of his brother monarch, but reflecting that the passes of the Alps were in the hands of the men whom he was persecuting, and that should he continue his oppressions, the Vaudois might open the gates of his kingdom to the enemy, he sent orders to Bersour to stop the persecution in the valleys. In 1536, the Waldensian Church had to mourn the loss of one of the more distinguished of her pastors. Martin Gonin of Androgna, a man of public spirit and rare gifts, who had gone to Geneva on ecclesiastical affairs, was returning through Dauphine when he was apprehended on suspicion of being a spy. He cleared himself of that charge, but the jailer searching his person and discovering certain papers upon him, he was convicted of what the Parliament of Grenoble accounted a much greater crime, heresy. Condemned to die, he was led forth at night and drowned in the river Isère. He would have suffered at the stake had not his persecutors feared the effect of his dying words upon the spectators. There were others also called to ascend the martyr pile, whose names we must not pass over in silence. 2 pastors returning from Geneva to their flocks in the valleys, in company of 3 French Protestants, were seized at the Col de Demirs, in Savoy, and carried to Chambéry. There all 5 were tried, condemned, and burned. The fate of Nicolas Sartois is yet more touching. He was a student of theology at Geneva, and held one of those bursaries which the lords of Bern had allotted for the training of young men as pastors in the churches of the valleys. He set out to spend his holiday with his family in Piedmont. We know how the Vaudois heart yearns for its native mountains. Nor would the coming of the youth awaken less lively anticipations on the part of his friends. The paternal threshold, alas, he was never to cross. His native valleys he was to tread no more. Traveling by the pass of St. Bernard and the Grand Valley of Aosta, he had just passed the Italian frontier when he was apprehended on the suspicion of heresy. It was the month of May, when all was life and beauty in the vales and mountains around him. He himself was in the springtime of existence. It was hard to lay down life at such a moment. But the great captain from whose feet he had just come had taught him that the first duty of a soldier of Christ is obedience. He confessed his Lord, nor could promises or threats, and both were tried, make him waver. He continued steadfast unto the end, and on the 4th of May, 1557, he was brought forth from his dungeon at Aosta and burned alive. The martyr who died thus heroically at Aosta was a youth. The one we are now to contemplate was a man of 50. Geoffrey Varea was a native of the town of Busco in Piedmont. His father had been a captain in that army of murderers who, in 1488, ravaged the valleys of Lucerna and Grosna. The son, in 1520, became a monk, and possessing the gift of a rare eloquence, he was sent on a preaching tour in company with another cowled ecclesiastic, yet more famous, Bernardo Ochino of Siena, the founder of the order of the Capuchins. The arguments of the men he was sent to convert staggered Varea. He fled to Geneva, and in the city of the reformers he was taught more fully the, quote, way of life. Ordained as a pastor, he returned to the valleys where, quote, like another Paul, says Leger, he preached the faith he once destroyed. After a ministry of some months, he set out to pay a visit of a few days to his native town of Busco. He was apprehended by the monks who were lying in wait for him. He was condemned to death by the Inquisition of Turin. His execution took place in the castle piazza of the same city, March 29, 1558. He walked to the place where he was to die, with a firm step and a serene countenance. He addressed the vast multitude around his pile in a way that drew tears from many eyes. After this he began to sing with a loud voice, and so continued, till he sank amid the flames. 2 years before this, the same piazza, the castle yard at Turin, had witnessed a similar spectacle. Barthélemy Hector was a bookseller in Poitiers. A man of warm but well-tempered zeal, he travelled as far as the valleys, diffusing that knowledge that maketh wise unto salvation. The assemblage of white peaks that looked down on the Prat Tour is one named La Vachera, so called because of the cows that loved the rich grass that clothed its sides in summertime. Barthélemy Hector would take his seat on the slopes of the mountain, and gathering the herdsmen and agriculturists of the Prat around him, would induce them to buy his books by reading passages to them. Portions of the scriptures also would he recite to the grandames and maidens as they watched their goats or plied the distaff. His steps were tracked by the Inquisitor, even amid these wild solitudes. He was dragged to Turin to answer for the crime of selling Genovese books. His defense before his judges discovered an admirable courage and wisdom. Quote, "You have been caught in the act," said his judge, "of selling books that contain heresy. What say you?" "If the Bible is heresy to you, it is truth to me," replied the prisoner. "But you use the Bible to deter men from going to Mass," urged the judge. "If the Bible deters men from going to Mass," responded Barthélemy, "it is a proof that God disapproves of it, and that the Mass is idolatry." The judge, deeming it expedient to make short shrift with such a heretic, exclaimed, "Retract!" "I have spoken only truth," said the bookseller. "Can I change truth as I would a garment?" His judges kept him some months in prison, in the hope that his recantation would save them the necessity of burning him. This unwillingness to have resort to the last penalty was owing to no feeling of pity for the prisoner, but entirely to the conviction that these repeated executions were endangering the cause of their church. Quote, "The smoke of these martyr piles," as was said with reference to the death of Patrick Hamilton, "was infecting those on whom it blew." But the constancy of Barthélemy compelled his persecutors to disregard these prudential considerations. At last, despairing of his abjuration, they brought him forth and consigned him to the flames. His behavior at the stake drew rivers of tears, says Leger, from the eyes of many in the popish crowd around his stake, while others vented reproaches and invectives against the cruelty of the monks and the inquisitors. These are only a few of the many martyrs by whom, even during this period of comparative peace and prosperity, the Church of the Valleys was called to testify against Rome. Some of these martyrs perished by cruel, barbarous, and most horrible methods. To recite all these cases would be beyond our purpose, and to depict the revolting and infamous details would be to narrate what no reader could peruse. We shall quote only part of the brief summary of Muston. "There is no town in Piedmont," says he, "under a Vaudois pastor, where some of our brethren have not been put to death. Hugo Chiamps of Finestral had his entrails torn from his living body at Turenne. Peter Gamerelli of Bobbio, in like manner, had his entrails taken out at Lucerna, and a fierce cat thrust into their place to torture him further. Maria Romano was buried alive at Roccopatia. Magdalene Fulano underwent the same fate at San Giovanni. Susan Michelini was bound hand and foot and left to perish of cold and hunger at Saracina. Bartholomew Foch, gashed with sabres, had the wounds filled with quicklime and perished thus in agony at Faneuil. Daniel Michelini had his tongue torn out at Bobbio for having praised God. James Baradari perished covered with sulphurous matches, which had been forced into his flesh under the nails, between the fingers, in the nostrils, in the lips, and all over his body, and then lighted. Daniel Ravelli had his mouth filled with gunpowder, which, being lighted, blew his head to pieces. Maria Monin, taken at Liuza, had the flesh cut from her cheek and chin bone, so that her jaw was left bare, and she was thus left to perish. Paul Garnier was slowly sliced to pieces at Rora. Thomas Barghetti was mutilated in an indescribable manner at Mirabocco, and Susan Joaquin cut in bits at La Torre. Sarah Rastignol was slit open from the legs to the bosom, and so left to perish on the road between Irol and Lucerna. Anne Charbonnier was impaled and carried thus on a pike as a standard from San Giovanni to La Torre. Daniel Rambaud at Paisano had his nails torn off, then his fingers chopped off, then his feet and his hands, then his arms and his legs, with each successive refusal on his part to abjure the gospel. Thus the roll of martyrs runs on, and with each new sufferer comes a new, a more excruciating and more horrible mode of torture and death. We have already mentioned the demand which the King of France made upon the Duke of Savoy, Charles III, that he would permit him to march an army through his territories. The reply was a refusal, but Francis I must needs have a road into Italy. Accordingly he seized upon Piedmont, and held possession of it, together with the Waldensian valleys for 23 years. The Waldenses had found the sway of Francis I more tolerant than that of their own princes. For though Francis hated Lutheranism, the necessities of his policy often compelled him to court the Lutherans, and so it came to pass that while he was burning heretics in Paris, he spared them in the valleys. But the general peace of Château Cambrésis, April 3, 1559, restored Piedmont, with the exception of Turin, to its former rulers of the House of Savoy. Charles III had been succeeded in 1553 by Emmanuel Philibert. Philibert was a prince of superior talents and humane disposition, and the Vaudois cherished the hope that under him they would be permitted to live in peace, and to worship as their fathers had done. What strengthened these just expectations was the fact that Philibert had married a sister of the King of France, Henry II, who had been carefully instructed in the Protestant faith by her illustrious relations, Margaret, Queen of Navarre, and Renée of France, daughter of Louis XII. But alas, the treaty that restored Emmanuel Philibert to the throne of his ancestors contained a clause binding the contracting parties to extinguish heresy. This was to send him back to his subjects with a dagger in his hand. Whatever the king might incline, and strengthened by the counsels of his Protestant queen, he would doubtless, if he could, have dealt humanely by his faithful subjects, the Vaudois. His intentions were overborne by men of stronger wills and more determined resolves. The inquisitors of his kingdom, the nuncio of the Pope, and the ambassadors of Spain and France, united in urging upon him the purgation of his dominions, in terms of the agreement in the treaty of peace. The unhappy monarch, unable to resist these powerful solicitations, issued on the 15th of February, 1560, an edict forbidding his subjects to hear the Protestant preachers in the valley of Lucerna, or anywhere else, under pain of a fine of $100 of gold for the first offense, and of the galleys for life of the second. This edict had reference mainly to the Protestants on the plain of Piedmont, who resorted in crowds to hear sermon in the valleys. There followed, however, in a short time, a yet severer edict, commanding attendance at Mass under pain of death. To carry out this cruel decree, a commission was given to the Prince of the Blood, Philip of Savoy, Count de Rocones, and with him was associated George Costa, Count de la Trinta, and Thomas Jacomel, the Inquisitor General, a man as cruel in disposition as he was licentious in manners. To these was added a certain Councillor Corbus, but he was not of the stuff which the business required, and so, after witnessing a few initial scenes of barbarity and horror, he resigned his commission. The first burst of the tempest fell on Carignano. This town reposes sweetly on one of the spurs of the Apennines, about 20 miles to the southwest of Turin. It contains many Protestants, some of whom were of good position. The wealthiest were selected and dragged to the burning pile, in order to strike terror into the rest. The blow had not fallen in vain. The professors of the Protestant creed in Carignano were scattered. Some fled to Turin, then under the domination of France, some to other places, and some, alas, frightened by the tempest in front, turned back and sought refuge in the darkness behind them. They had desired the, quote, better country, but could not enter in at the cost of exile and death. Having done its work in Carignano, this desolating tempest held its way across the plain of Piedmont toward those great mountains which were the ancient fortress of the truth, making its track through the villages and country communes in terror, in pillage, and blood. It moved like one of those thunderclouds which the traveler on the Alps may often descry beneath them, traversing the same plain, and shooting its lightnings earthward as it advances. Wherever it was known that there was a Vaudois congregation, thither did the cloud turn. And now we behold it at the foot of the Waldensian Alps, at the entrance of the valleys, within whose mighty natural bulwarks crowds of fugitives from the towns and villages on the plain have already found asylum. Rumors of the confiscations, arrests, cruel tortures, and horrible deaths which had befallen the churches at the foot of their mountains had preceded the appearance of the Crusaders at the entrance of the valleys. The same devastation which had befallen the flourishing churches on the plain of Piedmont seemed to impend over the churches in the bosom of the Alps. At this juncture the pastors and leading laymen assembled to deliberate on the steps to be taken. Having fasted and humbled themselves before God, they sought by earnest prayer the direction of His Holy Spirit. they resolved to approach the throne of their prince, and by humble remonstrance and petition set forth the state of their affairs and the justice of their cause. Their first claim was to be heard before being condemned, a right denied to no one accursed, however criminal. They next solemnly disclaimed the main offense laid to their charge, that of departing from the true faith and of adopting doctrines unknown to the Scriptures and the early ages of the Church. Their faith was that which Christ himself had taught, which the apostles, following their great Master, had preached, which the fathers had vindicated with their pens and the martyrs with their blood, and which the first 4 councils had ratified and proclaimed to be the faith of the Christian world. From the quote, old paths, the Bible and all antiquity being witnesses, they had never turned aside. From father to son they had continued these 1,500 years to walk therein. Their mountains shielded no novelties, they had bowed the knee to no strange gods, and if they were heretics, so too were the first 4 councils, and so too were the apostles themselves. If they erred, it was in the company of the confessors and martyrs of the early ages. They were willing any moment to appeal their cause to a general council, provided that council were willing to decide the question by the only infallible standard they knew, the Word of God. If on this evidence they should be convicted of even one heresy, most willingly would they surrender it. On this, the main point of their indictment, what more could they promise? Show us, they said, what the errors are which you ask us to renounce under the penalty of death, and you shall not need to ask a second time. Their duty to God did not weaken their allegiance to their prince. To piety they added loyalty. The throne before which they now stood had not more faithful and devoted subjects than they. When had they plotted treason or disputed lawful command of their sovereign? Nay, the more they feared God, the more they honored the king. Their services, their substance, their life were all at the disposal of their prince. They were willing to lay them all down in defense of his lawful prerogative. One thing that they could not surrender, their conscience. As regarded their Romanist fellow subjects of Piedmont, they had lived in good neighborhood with them. Whose person had they injured? Whose property had they robbed? Whom had they overreached in their bargains? Had they not been kind, courteous, and honest? If their hills had vied in fertility with the naturally richer plains at their feet, and if their mountain homes had been filled with store of corn and oil and wine, not always found in Piedmontese dwellings, to what was this owing, save to their superior industry, frugality, and skill? Never had marauding expedition, descending from their hills to carry off the goods of their neighbors, or to inflict retaliation for the many murders and robberies to which they had had to submit. Why then should their neighbors rise against them to exterminate them as if they were a horde of evildoers in whose neighborhood no man could live in peace? And why should their sovereign unsheathe the sword against them who had never been found disturbers of his kingdom, nor plotters against his government, but who, on the contrary, had ever striven to maintain the authority of his law and the honor of his throne? One thing is certain, most serene prince, they said in conclusion, that the word of God will not perish, but will abide forever. If then our religion is the pure word of God, as we are persuaded it is, and not a human invention, no human power will be able to abolish it. Now never was there a more solemn or more just or a more respectful remonstrance presented to any throne. The wrong about to be done them was enormous, yet not an angry word nor a single accusatory sentence do the Vaudois permit themselves to utter. But to what avail this solemn protest, this triumphant vindication? The more complete and conclusive it is, the more manifest does it make the immense injustice and the flagrant criminality of the House of Savoy. The more the Vaudois put themselves in the right, the more they put the Church of Rome in the wrong, and they who have already doomed them to perish are but the more resolutely determined to carry out their purpose. This document was accompanied by 2 others, one to the Queen and one to the Council. The one to the Queen is differently conceived from that to the Duke. They offer no apology for their faith. The Queen herself was of it. They allude in a few touching terms to the sufferings they had already been subjected to, and to the yet greater that appeared to impend. This was enough, they knew, to awaken all her sympathies, and enlist her as their advocate with the king. After the example of Esther and other noble women in former times, who valued their lofty station less for its dazzling honors than for the opportunities it gave them of shielding the persecuted confessors of the truth. The remonstrance presented to the council was couched in terms more plain and direct, yet still respectful. They bade the counselors of the king beware what they did. They warned them that every drop of innocent blood they should spill, they would one day have to account for. That if the blood of Abel, though only that of one man, cried with a voice so loud that God heard it from heaven, and came down to call its shedder to a reckoning, how much mightier the cry that would arise from the blood of a whole nation, and how much more terrible the vengeance with which it would be visited. In fine, they reminded the council that what they asked was not an unknown privilege in Piedmont, nor would they be the first or the only persons who had enjoyed that indulgence if it should be extended to them. Did not the Jew and the Saracen live unmolested in their cities? Did they not permit the Israelite to build his synagogue and the Moor to read his Koran without annoyance or restraint? Was it a great thing that the faith of the Bible should be placed in the same level in this respect with that of the Crescent, and that the descendants of the men who for generations had been the subject of the House of Savoy, and who had enriched the dominions with their virtues, and defended them with their blood, should be treated with the same humanity that was shown to the alien and the unbeliever? These petitions the confessors of the Alps dispatched to the proper quarter, and having done so, they waited an answer with eyes lifted up to heaven. If that answer should be peace, with what gratitude to God and to their prince would they hail it? Should it be otherwise, they were ready to accept the alternative too. They were prepared to die.